Some of the details you're about to hear are disturbing.
I'm weeping. I'm weeping because the kid, she didn't have to kill them kids. She didn't have to do it. I heard the kids around 11:30. Whoever was down there was picking these kids up and they was crying. And one kid said, "Mommy, no, mommy, no, mommy." And I heard a little boy through the floor was kind of crying.
Some stories stay with you forever. Sometimes they haunt you. And this one is one of those stories. Neighbors would later say they heard screams, piercing, desperate cries of two young children begging their mother for mercy. 5 days later, their apartment was silent. The smell in the hallway was the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong. This is the chilling story of Jamria Hall, a mother who fought for custody of her children, and just weeks later, ended their lives. From the outside, Jamria Hall looked like any other single mother in Baltimore, trying to make ends meet. She posted about her kids, talked about parenting challenges, and even hosted a small podcast where she jokingly called them her mini-men. To her friends, she was protective, even doting. But beneath that carefully maintained image was a history that hinted at instability. In 2018, Jamria was charged with arson and child endangerment. Authorities revealed she had intentionally set fire to her parents' home while her children were inside. Miraculously, they survived. Because of that, she lost custody. For many, this should have been the end of her parental rights. But somehow, after serving just a year in prison, Jamria regained full custody of her children when their father did not contest the court's decision. That decision would prove catastrophic. The children at the heart of this tragedy were 8-year-old Davin and 6-year-old Danaria. Davin was described as a sweet, curious boy who loved playing video games and drawing superheroes. His younger sister, Danaria, was full of energy, a chatty little girl with an infectious laugh who adored her big brother. To outsiders, the family seemed to be adjusting. Jamria spoke lovingly of her children on her podcast, calling them her joy, even while admitting they could be a handful. She seemed like a mom trying to rebuild her life after a rocky past. But behind closed doors, her struggles were far darker than anyone realized. Court documents would later reveal that Jamria had been spiraling. Witnesses described her as erratic and often talking to herself in the street. She had been seen yelling at invisible people, muttering under her breath, and acting paranoid. Family members raised concerns, but without physical evidence of abuse, there was little they could do. This is where many viewers might pause and ask, how could this happen? How could a woman with a violent history regain custody of two children so young and vulnerable? The answer is a devastating mix of systemic failure and missed opportunities. Life appeared calm in Jamria's apartment on Coventry Road. Neighbors often saw the children playing outside, waving politely. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until the night of August. That night,
one of the children's gasping. They look like they've all been in the back of the head. The two adults are dead in the bed.
Okay. And do they have wounds too?
Fire medical service. Yes.
Okay.
Did not hang up. There's blood coming out their ears.
That's what a neighbor told police. They heard 6-year-old Danira screaming from inside her home in southwest Baltimore August 19th, according to these court documents. The little girl and her brother Davin found dead inside the apartment 5 days later. 2 children now gone, according to police, at the hands of their mother, Jamria Hall. Her charging documents detailing the shocking and disturbing details surrounding their.
A neighbor reported hearing what sounded like screaming and crying from the apartment. They described a little girl's voice, shouting something they couldn't fully make out, then silence. No one called the police. The next morning, the apartment seemed quiet. Over the next few days, something else began to raise suspicion. A foul odor seeping into the hallway. Neighbors complained to building management. Maintenance staff were sent to check the unit. What they found would haunt them forever. When the maintenance worker opened the apartment door, he was hit with the smell of decay. Inside, the lights were dim, and the air was stifling. As he stepped further in, he saw something that made him stagger backward. The bodies of 2 children, Davin and Danaria, were in. Davin's small body was found in a sleeping bag, stabbed in the chest. His little sister had been strangled and left in the bathtub. Both children had been dead for days. The scene was described as one of the most heartbreaking in Baltimore's recent history. Police rushed to secure the area, quickly realizing
These details in this document are horrific. It details how the children were found and that neighbors heard screams. What it doesn't say is why. Why these children? A question that remains.
that this was no accident. There were no signs of forced entry. The only person who could have done this was their mother. But Jamria Hall was gone. By August 24, 2021, the search for Jamria Hall was underway. Detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements. The mother who had once fought to bring her children home was now their prime suspect. But nothing could prepare them for what she would say when they finally found her. The search for Jamria Hall became a top priority for Baltimore police. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with anyone who might have seen her in the days leading up to the discovery. Neighbors recalled her behavior as increasingly unstable, with one person mentioning seeing her throw out her children's beds just days before their deaths. It was a chilling detail that hinted at planning, not impulse. Surveillance footage from the apartment building captured Jamria leaving alone, calm and composed, not like a woman in panic. She took an Uber out of the city, vanishing into Baltimore County. Detectives moved fast, pulling her phone records, cross-referencing her known hangouts, and contacting family members. They soon learned she had lied to her mother, claiming the children were staying with their father. But when investigators questioned him, he revealed he hadn't seen them in weeks and described Jamria's recent behavior as paranoid and erratic. The pieces were beginning to form a terrifying picture. On August 25th, just one day after the grim discovery, police tracked Jamria down. She was located through digital records and surveillance images, walking calmly into a building in Baltimore County. Officers closed in, and she was arrested without resistance. What happened next shocked even veteran detectives. In the interrogation room, Jamria didn't cry, protest, or deny involvement. She confessed. With a chilling calmness, she admitted she had strangled 6-year-old Jamria and stabbed 8-year-old Davin. Detectives were stunned by her composure. She recounted her actions as if she were
executed a search warrant on the 25th at the defendant's residence, located bloody baby wipes in a garbage bag in the sunroom where the defendant was sleeping with the complainant. There was no diaper in the bag where the wipes were recovered.
Also, it's alleged scratches found around the baby's neck. Other evidence there too, just a little too disturbing to share with you here on TV.
Detached from the horror she had caused, her tone was flat, her words measured. The children she had fought so hard to regain were gone, and she expressed no remorse. As police processed the crime scene, they uncovered evidence that made the case even darker. Investigators found letters Jamria had written in the days leading up to the murders. In one, she spoke of feeling trapped, emotionally exhausted, and overwhelmed by her custody struggle. But one chilling detail stood out. She had made plans to burn the apartment after killing her children. This wasn't a spontaneous act of a distressed mother. This was a calculated decision to erase everything. For the community and law enforcement, it was almost impossible to comprehend. How could a woman with such a violent past be allowed to regain custody? How had the system failed these two innocent children so completely? News of the case spread quickly through Baltimore and beyond. Parents held their own children closer, horrified by the thought of a mother turning on her own. Social services were criticized heavily, with questions raised about why Jamria's arson conviction and prior charges hadn't been a permanent barrier to her regaining custody. The Maryland Department of Human Services remained silent, citing confidentiality laws, but the public outrage was deafening. Reporters stood outside the apartment complex, where balloons, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes began to pile up in a growing memorial. "Fly high, little angels," one note read. "You deserved better." Meanwhile, prosecutors worked to build their case. Jamria's confession gave them a strong foundation, but they knew the defense would attempt to paint her as mentally ill and incapable of standing trial. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered. Jamria claimed she had suffered a psychotic break and experienced hallucinations and delusions that led her to murder her children. But when mental health professionals examined her, they determined she was not psychotic. They concluded that she was likely faking symptoms to avoid prison. It was a chilling realization for investigators. This crime was not born of madness, but of deliberate cruelty. Detectives also revisited Jamria's 2018 arson case, reviewing transcripts and evidence to see if there had been warning signs overlooked by the courts. In that case, she had set fire to her parents' home after disabling smoke detectors and removing family photos. Her children had been trapped inside but survived, She served a year in prison before being released, and when the children's father failed to contest custody, the court returned them to her. In hindsight, this decision seemed unthinkable. Prosecutors pointed to this history as proof that Jamria was a danger long before the murders. The trial preparation.
Louis Luna was scheduled to appear before a judge around 10 o'clock this morning, but according to the judge, they are running behind in the dockets. But this is a horrific case, and looking over some of those court documents, it now shows that Luna is accused of blocking the child's nose with an unknown object. Now, according to the Harris County Sheriff's Office, those deputies were called out to an apartment complex in the 1500 block of West Park for an unresponsive infant. EMS treated the 9-month-old, but she was later pronounced dead at the hospital. And according to the Sheriff's Office, they say that an autopsy revealed that she had been sexually assaulted and died due to asphyxiation. Now, homicide investigators say that the baby's father, Louis Luna, is accused of her murder, and he has been charged with capital murder. Again, he is set to appear before a judge this afternoon.
Her daughter was brutally murdered, taken from her too early, and so, she didn't get to ever celebrate her first birthday. She didn't get to take her to pre-K, see her take her first steps or any of that stuff. So she missed out on all that stuff because of what this man did.
How difficult are cases like this?
They're difficult because they involve children, and especially a child of this age. I mean, she couldn't walk, she couldn't talk. She had no voice, and so the jury really was the voice for this little girl and spoke for her by its verdict.
The trial lasted 10 days and the jury reached a verdict within a matter of hours. Since it was a capital case, Luna has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
The operation was intense, with investigators piecing together a timeline that showed Jamria's mental decline and her calculated action. Surveillance footage captured her calmly walking away from her apartment after the killings, her demeanor detached. Phone records showed she had been communicating with friends and family, pretending everything was fine. This was not the behavior of someone in a psychotic break. Prosecutors argued this was cold, calculated planning. As her story made national headlines, Jamria's name became synonymous with one of Maryland's most horrifying cases of maternal filicide. People who had once seen her as a struggling single mother now struggled to reconcile that image with the woman who had confessed to murdering her children. Reporters interviewed neighbors who recalled hearing the screams on August. One woman tearfully told local news she would never forgive herself for not calling the police. Another resident described the haunting smell that lingered in the hallways, a smell she would never forget. Jamria remained behind bars as her defense team began preparing their case, arguing that she had suffered a complete mental breakdown. But the evidence painted a much darker picture. The prosecution prepared to present the letters she had written, the evidence of her plan to burn the apartment, and her eerie calmness in the interrogation room. To them, it was clear this was not a mother in crisis, but a killer who had meticulously planned the murder of her own children.
Baltimore was shaken by the case. Families across the city watched in disbelief. As details emerged, the community rallied together to mourn Davin and Dananaria, whose bright futures were cut short. Teachers from their school described them as joyful, curious, and kind. Their deaths left a void that could never be filled. And at the center of it all was a mother who had betrayed the very vow that parenthood represents, to protect and love your children above all else. As Jamria awaited trial, detectives worked tirelessly to ensure justice for Davin and Dananaria. What they uncovered in the following months would add even more complexity to an already heartbreaking story. The trial would not only expose her actions, but also reveal systemic failures that allowed this tragedy to happen. The question that haunted everyone was simple but devastating. How did no one stop her before it was too late? As Jamria sat in custody, investigators began assembling the full timeline of events that led to the murders. What they found painted a disturbing picture of calculated cruelty. After killing her children, she had spent days pretending everything was normal, texting family and acquaintances, while her children's lifeless bodies remained in the apartment. There were no frantic calls for help, no attempt to cover up the crime in haste. Instead, her actions were chillingly methodical. Detectives pieced together surveillance footage, showing her calmly taking an Uber out of the city, appearing composed, almost indifferent. When she was finally located and brought in for questioning, she confessed without hesitation, speaking in a tone so flat and detached
that even experienced officers were shaken. She admitted she strangled her 6-year-old daughter and stabbed her 8-year-old son, recounting the sequence of events without remorse. Her demeanor baffled detectives. Some wondered if she was in shock or mentally unstable, but mental health experts quickly noted her responses were calculated, not confused. She was coherent, aware, and disturbingly calm. The defense tried to steer her case in another direction, claiming Jamria had suffered a complete psychotic break that left her unable to understand her actions. They argued that she was hallucinating, delusional, and in need of psychiatric care rather than prison. The prosecution, however, wasn't convinced. They presented the evidence of her meticulous actions, the letters she wrote before the killings, the decision to discard her children's beds prior to the murders, and her plan to set the apartment on fire afterward. These weren't the choices of someone lost in psychosis, they argued, but of someone with intent. The courtroom was gripped by the shocking details. Prosecutors described the crime scene, the smell that led to the discovery, and the condition of the children's body. Their goal was to ensure that no one in that room could believe Jamria had simply snapped. They emphasized the timeline, her deceptive behavior after the murders, and her confession, which was delivered without emotion. The defense countered by bringing in psychiatric experts, who evaluated Jamria over months. They testified about her history of trauma, emotional instability, and previous mental health struggle. They argued that her actions were not fully conscious decisions, but the result of a severe mental health crisis. The jury listened intently as both sides painted two very different portraits of the same woman, one of a calculated killer, and the other of a broken mother consumed by mental illness. The investigation also shined a harsh spotlight on Baltimore's child welfare system. Reporters dug into court records, discovering that Jamria had been allowed to regain full custody of her children despite a violent past. The revelation sparked outrage among parents and child advocates, who demanded answers. How could someone who had previously been convicted of arson and child endangerment, who had endangered her children before, be trusted with their care again? Critics argued that systemic failings and bureaucratic oversight had cost Davin and Dananeria their lives. Officials at the Maryland Department of Human Services remained tight-lipped, citing confidentiality, but their silence only fueled public anger. In interviews, neighbors expressed deep regret over not calling the police the night they heard the screams. One woman admitted she had heard what sounded like a child pleading, but she assumed it was a normal family argument. Another neighbor described feeling guilt for not knocking on the door or contacting authorities sooner. These confessions were heartbreaking reminders of how many lives are touched by one act of violence. The apartment building became a symbol of sorrow, with a growing memorial of candles, stuffed animals, and flowers outside the front entrance. People from all over the city came to pay their respects to the two children, whose lives were taken too soon. The prosecution's case grew stronger as more details came to light. Investigators revealed that Jamria had lied to family members about the children's whereabouts, claiming they were staying with their father. This deception allowed her to delay suspicion for several days, during which time the children's bodies remained in her home. Prosecutors argued this was proof of premeditation and awareness. In addition, forensic evidence supported their claim. Autopsy results showed that both children died at different times, suggesting that Jamria killed one child first and then waited before killing the other. For prosecutors, this detail shattered any argument that her actions were sudden or impulsive.
Her defense team, however, continued to fight, citing Jamria's unstable childhood, previous mental health issues, and the psychological toll of losing custody and then regaining it. They claimed her actions were born of extreme emotional distress, not malice. Mental health evaluations became a central focus of the trial, with experts debating whether Jamria was truly capable of understanding her actions at the time of the murders. While some testified she exhibited traits consistent with psychosis, others insisted she was fully aware of what she was doing. The conflicting testimonies left jurors struggling to determine if Jamria's case fit the legal definition of criminal insanity. Outside the courtroom, the case became a topic of national discussion. News outlets across the country reported on the tragedy, with commentators pointing out flaws in the family court system. Advocates called for stricter guidelines for reunifying parents with children after a violent history. The story of Davin and Danaria became a rallying cry for reform, with their names often mentioned in conversations about protecting vulnerable children from systemic failures. Their smiling faces appeared in news broadcasts,
and on posters at candlelight vigils, reminders of the devastating consequences of overlooking warning signs. As the trial continued, the evidence against Jamaria mounted. Detectives presented her search history, her social media activity, and her written notes. They showed the jury photos of the discarded beds she had thrown away before the killings, suggesting she had planned the crime in advance. They revealed texts she sent to family members pretending everything was fine while her children lay dead in her apartment. Every piece of evidence added weight to the prosecution's argument that Jamaria's actions were deliberate, not the result of a temporary break from reality. Despite this, the defense pressed forward, attempting to paint Jamaria as a deeply troubled woman who had slipped through the cracks of a broken system. They argued that she needed lifelong psychiatric care, not a prison cell. But for many watching, no argument could justify the brutality of her actions. The coldness of her confession, the deceptive calm she displayed, and the haunting details of the crime scene left a mark on everyone who heard them. The trial became a battle not just over Jamaria's fate, but over how society views justice when mental illness and premeditation collide. By the time closing arguments were delivered, the courtroom was heavy with tension. Families of the victims wept as prosecutors displayed photos of the children, reminding the jury that their innocence had been stolen. The defense urged compassion, asking the jury to consider Jamaria's state of mind, and yet the facts of the case weighed heavily. The jury would soon have to decide whether this woman was a criminal mastermind, a victim of her own mental illness, or something more complicated, a person who embodied both. Whatever they chose would determine not only her future but also how the world remembered this tragedy. The verdict in Jamaria Hall's case was one of the most highly anticipated decisions in Maryland's recent history. After weeks of testimony, conflicting psychiatric evaluations, and emotional witness accounts, the courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. Family members of Davin and Danaria clutched each other's hands, their faces pale with exhaustion from reliving the trauma. Reporters filled every seat, their cameras trained on the woman at the center of it all, who sat emotionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The jury found Jamaria guilty of murder and child abuse, but the next phase of the trial would determine if she would serve her time in a prison cell or be committed to a psychiatric hospital indefinitely. Mental health experts who had evaluated her testified once more, explaining that while she showed signs of emotional instability, her actions were deliberate and calculated. They concluded she was not psychotic, but Jamaria's defense team pressed for a verdict of not criminally responsible, arguing that her mental health struggles and history of trauma had clouded her judgment to the point of incapacity. In April 2024, nearly 3 years after the murders, Jamaria stood before a judge to hear her fate. She pleaded guilty to both murder and child abuse, but continued to claim she was not criminally responsible for her action. The judge took weeks to weigh the expert testimony and evidence before reaching a decision that shocked many. Jamaria would not go to prison. Instead, she would be committed indefinitely to a state-run psychiatric hospital, where she would remain under constant supervision. The ruling sparked outrage among members of the community and online commentators, many of whom believed that her calculated actions showed she should have been sentenced to prison. Others saw the verdict as a reflection of a system that fails both the mentally ill and the children they are supposed to protect.
For the families of Davin and Danaria, the ruling offered little closure. The pain of losing 2 innocent children in such a horrific way was a wound that could never truly heal. Their father, who had once shared custody with Jamaria, expressed his grief publicly, stating that he regretted not fighting harder in court to keep the children away from her. Friends and relatives described Davin as a bright, imaginative boy who loved drawing superheroes and making his little sister laugh, and Danaria as a bubbly, loving girl with a smile that could light up a room. Their absence was felt deeply at their school, where teachers struggled to explain to classmates why they would never see their friends again. Candlelight vigils were held in their memory, and a mural was painted in their honor with their faces surrounded by bright stars and angel wings. The case sparked a broader conversation about the failures of the child welfare and family court systems. Journalists uncovered details about how Jamaria had been allowed to regain custody of her children despite a violent criminal record that included arson and child endangerment. Critics argued that the system was too quick to reunite families without fully assessing the risk to the children involved.
Lawmakers began calling for reforms demanding stricter guidelines for custody hearings involving parents with a violent past. Some proposed new legislation that would require extended psychiatric evaluations and background checks before a parent could regain custody of their children. Advocates for children's safety insisted that Davin and Danaria's deaths should be a turning point, a tragic reminder that the system's first priority should always be protecting children, not giving second chances to those who have already harmed them. Inside the psychiatric facility where Jemaria was placed, she remained calm and largely unresponsive to questions about her crimes. Investigators said she rarely spoke of her children, never showing emotion or remorse when their names were mentioned. Her lack of empathy disturbed even the staff assigned to her care. For many following the case, this detachment seemed to confirm their belief that she had been fully aware of her actions and that justice had not been truly served. Yet legally, her commitment meant she would spend the rest of her life under strict psychiatric monitoring, never allowed to walk free without court approval. The hospital became her prison, but one that left many wondering if it was enough. As years passed, the story of Jemaria Hall and her children remained etched into the collective memory of Baltimore. It became a cautionary tale told by child advocates and domestic violence counselors, a stark example of how warning signs can be ignored until it's too late. Davin and Danaria's school dedicated a small garden in their memory, a quiet place where classmates and teachers could reflect on their loss. Every year on the anniversary of their deaths, the community gathered to light candles, not only to remember the siblings but also to remind each other of the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. Neighbors who had lived in the building at the time of the murders still carried guilt, some of them moving away because the smell and the screams haunted their dreams. The maintenance worker who discovered their bodies left his job shortly after, unable to return to that apartment complex without reliving the trauma of that day. Journalists who covered the case often reflected on the haunting image of Jemaria sitting in court, completely still, as the judge read the verdict. Her calmness contrasted sharply with the tears of family members, and that image became symbolic of the horror of the crime. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and news specials revisited the case, dissecting every detail in an attempt to understand what could drive a mother to such extremes. Yet even with all the facts laid bare, there was no satisfying answer. People could analyze her mental health history, her childhood trauma, her strained relationship with the children's father, and her erratic behavior, but none of it could justify the brutality of her action. In the end, the story of Jemaria Hall was more than just a horrific crime. It was a mirror reflecting systemic flaws, societal failures, and the deep complexities of mental illness and justice. For those who knew Davin and Danaria, it was simply a heartbreaking reminder of two innocent lives taken too soon. Their names became a rallying cry for reform, a call for better protections for vulnerable children, and a symbol of how love and safety should never be taken for granted. The legacy of this case lives on not because of the woman who committed the crime, but because of the two bright souls the world lost. And for their family, friends, and community, the fight for justice continues, not in the courtroom, but in making sure no other child slips through the cracks the way Davin and Danaria did.